Good morning. I'm Karlyn Bowman, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the last pre-election election watch session of the 2016 campaign. As usual, it's a pleasure to share the stage with my AEI colleagues Norman Ornstein and Michael Barone, and with Henry Olsen of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and John Fortier of the Bipartisan Policy Center. This is the election watch team, but there are also two very important members of the team in the audience today. And I'd like to recognize the work that Heather Sims and Eleanor O'Neill have done throughout this election campaign. They're largely responsible for the extraordinary handout that you have at all of your places and for a wonderful tool that will be up on the AEI website today, a swing states survey that should give you everything you need to know about key states in the election overall. There's wonderful data in this handout on split ticket voting, and we have our usual series of conventional and unconventional indicators, including hemlines and the NFL. It's just a wealth of data. Of course, the election is happening as we speak, and more Americans think that Hillary Clinton's going to win. In the University of Michigan's latest index of consumer sentiment, 71% expected her to win, up from 58% in July. The shift was concentrated primarily among Republicans and independents, but voters don't think it's going to be a landslide. Her lead is growing, her appeal is not. Neither candidate's favorability ratings have changed much since the convention. There's some evidence, though, from recent polls that her supporters are becoming more enthusiastic about her, while his supporters' enthusiasm is diminishing. We have a lot of ground to cover this morning, but I thought I would share with you one poll finding. 51% told Economist YouGov interviewers that they were looking forward to future presidential elections. 49% said that they were not. Well, although we have 1,162 days until January 2020, several candidates in our permanent campaign have been spotted in Iowa and New Hampshire already. Senator Tom Cotton, for one, spent 4 days in Iowa this month, so stay tuned. I'm going to start with Michael and ask each of the panelists to speak for about 5 minutes. And Michael, my first question to you is Trump's path narrow or is it non-existent?
Well, it looks very narrow. As one who predicted the election of President Romney, I'm reluctant to say it's non-existent, but I think it's very narrow. If you look right now at the average, RealClearPolitics.com average of recent polls, Trump is losing 26 electoral votes that Romney won in North Carolina and Arizona. And he is winning 25 electoral votes that Romney did not win in Ohio, Iowa, and the 2nd Congressional District of Maine. So he's won electoral, all this fuss, and you end up, perhaps, with an electoral vote that is 1 point off the previous election. We'll see about this. I note that one of the reasons I'm reluctant to say this is non-existent is that his path was non-existent is that, looking back on this campaign, you can see that Trump was within 1 or 2 points of Hillary Clinton on several occasions during this calendar year. And in fact, he was at the point when he launched his attacks on Judge Curiel, on Khizr Khan, and Miss Universe 1998. I calculated the number of days roughly that those stories about Trump predictably dominated the political news cycle and the total number of days, and it comes out to something like 13 out of 250 after the nominations were clinched. In other words, Trump has spent 5% of his time on attacks which have sent him directly downward in the polls from a point where he was roughly at parity. So I'm reluctant to say that it's not possible that some black swan event or perhaps even a gray swan event could get him back in contention where he clearly isn't now. I mean, he's behind 5%, 5.5% in 4- and 2-way polls. The poll trackers are variously rating his chances of winning from 2% to 15%. But we've also seen protest voters protesting against people casting votes against an establishment that have won despite mild or great polling evidence to the contrary in referenda. In the UK referenda on leaving the European Union, or so-called Brexit, on June 23rd, the Colombia peace agreement with the FARC on October 2nd. So I'm reluctant to say that it's impossible for Trump to win. It just seems to me to be extremely unlikely. And we've had at least previous examples when he came within striking distance of winning, he threw the election away or threw his position away. And I wouldn't bet on that not happening again. When I look at the couple of interesting things that I observe in the polling in this race, I took a look at what states, comparing current polling with the Obama-Romney margin in 2012 in the target states and the states that have some potentiality of becoming targets, such as Minnesota, Maine, too, and Michigan. When Trump was at parity in the polls, those look like they might be seriously contested. And currently, with Hillary Clinton about 5 points ahead, states like Arizona and Georgia, which look to be seriously competitive, as well as the 10 clearly identifiable target states from 2012. And what I found is that there has the Democratic margin in the target states, because Obama carried all of them except North Carolina, has diminished in 3 states compared to current polling: Ohio, Iowa, and Nevada. And that's in line with what we've seen through this cycle. Trump has an appeal to older voters, and he has an appeal to non-college grads. These states are demographically tilted in that direction. He also has an appeal, as I've argued during the primaries, for people who are low in social connectedness or social capital, what our colleague Charles Murray has written about in Coming Apart. Robert Putnam wrote about it in Bowling Alone. Community ties, church ties, religious ties, voluntary association ties, extended family ties. People who have a lot of those ties really don't like Donald Trump. Prime example, Mormons, Latter-day Saints, which probably has the highest social connectedness of any identifiable group in America, and Trump is in a position where he may lose Utah, which was 72% for Mitt Romney. On the other hand, places like West Virginia and so forth, the Ohio River Valley has been going well. So we see that in Ohio, Iowa, and Nevada are states where he's doing better. Conversely, places that have large number or growing number of young and high college graduate whites, groups that have been repelled by Trump, have been moving toward the Democratic Party, particularly North Carolina and Virginia. It's as if we've had a lot of people going down the coast on I-95. They've left the northeastern states, and they're somewhat less Democratic than average. In the northeastern states, they've left them more Democratic, and they've made Virginia and North Carolina more Democratic because they've come into what were pre-existingly Republican states. So that's a pattern so far. Big factor we don't know about. Polls can't really tell us a lot about turnout. Hillary Clinton has depended on turnout high among groups in her effort to replicate the Obama 2012 51% majority. Black voters, who probably not going to be quite as high turnout or Democratic percentages before. Hispanics, who show up on polls to be about the lowest interest demographic that we have. And young voters who basically can't stand Trump, but really don't like Hillary much at all either, as we've seen in the primaries. They're going for third-party candidates in the general election. On the Republican side, Donald Trump seems to be trying to depress turnout with his charges that the election is rigged, and that can hurt other Republicans. So I conclude without trying to trod too heavily on John's turf on Senate races. Just to note that as I look down the numbers in the Senate races, they seem to be running rather independently of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and to be focused on the particular, at least in many states. We're not necessarily a straight ticket voting nation in this election as we were 4 years ago. And I think it's apparent in the Senate races, and it's apparent in the changes in relative standing of the states in the presidential election, which may or may not prove permanent after 2016.
Thanks, Michael. One quick question for you. 5 million people have already voted. How much stock do you put in what we're hearing about the early voting responses?
I think you're getting clues from the early voting responses. So far as I've been able to interpret the clues, it says Democrats are doing marginally better than they were in 2012 when they had a clear advantage organizationally over Republicans. But you're gauging who voted by what their party registration is. Party registration is never an entirely good substitute for party identification when pollsters ask which party you're voting for, or actual voting behavior. And it may be less so at the presidential level and even in some of the Senate races than it was in 2012 and 2014. So I think it would take a pretty good Sherlock Holmes to get something really conclusive from those clues.
Thank you, Michael. John, why don't you walk us through the Senate races and the governors in the House? It's a big assignment.
Just a few minutes, yeah.
5 minutes.
Thank you. So just quickly, I think these are all affected by something at the top of the ticket, so I'll say a couple things about the national mood. I think Michael was right to indicate that there are a couple of paths here. Donald Trump obviously is in a worse position than he was when we last spoke, and even then he was behind. He was behind in the polls. Certainly things have happened that you can all point to that have made Donald Trump less popular and do worse in the polls. But I think also you just have seen a natural moving of some of the undecided voters to one camp or the other, and that has also increased Hillary Clinton's lead. You've seen the numbers for Gary Johnson and Jill Stein go down in most polls. You've seen the few undecideds out there decided, and that has increased Hillary Clinton's lead as well. I guess the question is, at one point when Donald Trump was doing as well as he did, I was looking at a race where it might have looked a lot like the Romney-Obama race, a similar margin. For a little while, I think we were thinking that race might look more like the Obama-McCain race, which was 4 points higher, essentially. I think we're probably somewhere in between now. The polling averages are in the 6% margin range. That's a pretty good win. It's probably not enough to get to the House. Probably not enough to push the House into Democratic hands, but it's enough to do some more in the Democratic direction. And the last thing I would point to, just since we're all going to be watching on election night, one phenomenon that we've seen to be mindful of is that election night results, the ones we see that night or even the next morning, have been less and less comprehensive over the years. There's more of a vote out there to be counted, more absentee ballots in particular, more provisional votes, and we see the numbers move substantially over the course of the election that is reported the night after the election to 3 or 4 or 5 days later, where the final, and actually even 20 days later or 28 days later when California comes in, what the final results are. If you watched on election night in 2012, you would have thought, well, Mitt Romney lost by a little bit more than 3 percentage points. But by the time all the votes were counted, it was close to 4%. And it is not random. It is generally a Democratic move, a Democratic phenomenon. Partly it's the western states with lots of absentee ballots. But it is something to watch, that what you see on election night might be slightly different and probably slightly more Democratic as we move forward. What does the Senate look like? The Senate, I mean, it's pretty simple math. You have, for Democrats to pick up 4 seats and win the presidency, they will control the Senate. They will have a majority, with the tie broken by the vice president. And there are 2 seats that are still very, very likely to go in the Democratic direction in Illinois and Wisconsin. That hasn't changed. And then there's 6 other seats which are really much more competitive. And they vary a bit, but there are 6 seats that if Democrats were to win, since they hold only one of those seats, they essentially need to win 3 more seats of those 6 that's a pretty good chance. These seats are all possible for Democrats to win. They are, quickly, New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, where Kelly Ayotte and Pat Toomey are in very difficult races. I will say they are certainly not out of it. Their polling is relatively good. It's close, but they are certainly also places that Donald Trump is going to lose, and that the races could go the other way. Indiana and Nevada, just quickly, Indiana, I think Democrats were very excited to have Evan Bayh jump in the race, a well-known figure, had won statewide, the governor and Senate level before, but he did have some problems, some initial stumbles where voters were worried about his activities since he'd left the Senate, whether he'd been in Indiana enough, what sort of money he'd made. That seems to have stabilized, though. I think Republicans were hopeful that would lead to a kind of collapse in Evan Bayh's support. It has led to some lower numbers, but his poll numbers are actually pretty good. I'd say of all of these seats, he seems to be in the best shape to pick up a seat. Nevada, I think, is also a relatively close seat. That would be the one chance for Republicans to pick up a seat that it's now held by Democrats. Relatively close. And then two seats that I think Republicans wish they were not worrying about, but they are in North Carolina and Missouri, two states that are generally more Republican, although this year I think there's a good chance Donald Trump could lose in North Carolina. But in both of those races, I would say that certainly North Carolina, probably Richard Burr of these 6 seats has the best position to win. He's going to run ahead of Donald Trump. I even think the governor, Pat McCrory, is probably going to run ahead of Donald Trump now, which was not the case maybe a few weeks ago. But look, these are the 6 seats that are going to determine it. There's another seat out there people are watching, and that's Marco Rubio's seat in Florida, which I think most people thought that was Rubio going back into the Senate seat was a guarantee Republicans would win it. It certainly has boosted their chances, but as Florida is looking more and more unlikely for Donald Trump, as it's gotten a little closer, I think people are not. Some people are putting that in a toss-up category. If you see that race go against Marco Rubio, I think you're likely to see a lot of these seats fall, and you'll see a very, very big win. But I still think the odds are for a narrow Democratic win. But if the polls are still moving, which I'm not sure they are, I think they're kind of relatively stable at a not so good level for Republicans, then we'll see a close margin. But if things were to move a point or two more in the Democratic direction, you might see most of these seats fall. Governorships, quickly, you have Republicans control the vast majority of governorships, 31, 18 for Democrats. There's an independent in Alaska. And most of these seats, again, there's 6 of them that I would watch. Most of them are held by Democrats. Democrats hold New Hampshire, Vermont, West Virginia, Missouri, and Republicans currently hold North Carolina and Indiana. Again, of those seats, the one that I think would have, and still is probably the most endangered, is North Carolina with Pat McCrory, the governor there. He has improved his standing over the last couple of weeks. He's still, I think, probably on the edge and down a little bit in the polls. He's doing better than Donald Trump today, though. Donald Trump was also doing worse in North Carolina, and McCrory is doing better. But that's the one I think, if I had to pick one, that would be most likely to switch. But you can look in New Hampshire, Vermont, West Virginia, Missouri for Democrats held seats, and also in Indiana with the seat that Mike Pence has vacated. So wouldn't be surprised to see something of a wash given the number of seats the Democrats hold and that there are 6 of them. The House, I will say, since I don't have much time, very few things about the House. 30 seats are needed. That is still a big task. That number has gotten better for Democrats as the national numbers have gone in their favor. Both the generic ballot numbers are pretty good. Donald Trump's numbers are not great. I think you're likely to see in the 15 to maybe up to 20 seat margin for Democrats. If things get better, it could get close, but it's very hard to get to that 30 seat margin unless the bottom falls out, and it's a 10-point win for Hillary Clinton. Most places, again, you'll see some realignments, places like California and some Florida seats that are really going to be going in the Democratic direction. There are a few outliers which point to Michael's point where Donald Trump and Republicans in the House will do better with Trump on the ticket. One maybe in the 2nd District of Maine, a seat that he's been doing pretty well in, the district that Trump has been doing, where Bruce Poliquin might be able to hold on again as a Republican. Looking at Rick Nolan's seat, a rural mining Northeast Minnesota district, which is Democratic but is conservative in a way that I think Donald Trump is likely to win that district. There's the possibility for Republicans to actually take a seat. but the majority of seats are moving in the other direction. So I think, again, we are likely to see a substantial move in the Democratic direction, but unless this race breaks even more, the House looks like it is still a safe place for Republicans to govern next Congress.
John, very concise. Donald Trump has certainly talked a lot more about a rigged election, and you're one of the country's leading experts on election mechanics, on rigging overall. Tell us, first of all, what your thoughts are about some of the things he's been saying and whether or not it's really possible.
I'm not an expert on how to rig, or I don't.
Well, good.
I don't put out my shingle as to.
But for enough money.
You got an obvious client there.
I think Donald Trump probably means, and says he means a lot of things when he says that. But if we wanted to focus on some of the questions of machines and whether they could be hacked, it's a big country. It's a decentralized set of elections. There are things that are not perfect about our election system. But I guess the big thing I would stress is that the voting machines, while there are legitimate concerns as to whether we should have these types of voting machines or have them be a little bit more secure, they are not connected to the internet. They are standalone type machines that are not easily or not able to be manipulated from afar. And the ways in which the security flaws may be there involve a lot of getting into the machine and getting past lots of procedures of checking and auditing, and it's very difficult. So I guess I don't rule out the possibility of all sorts of little problems across the country. Most of them administrative problems, maybe some of them nefarious things, but small things. But the idea of a large-scale hacking of the election that would affect millions of voters and be able to turn a national election, I think, is far-fetched, and we should work to improve our election system, but we should not think that this is a real significant problem for our system.
John, one final question for you. Are we ahead of where we were 4 years ago in terms of early and absentee voting? And do you expect that number to be I think you said at the last election, what you thought it could be as high as 40%?
Yeah, I expect the number to be up. I mean, it's pretty simple that we've seen each election since the 80s, where the number of both votes by mail or votes cast at early voting centers has gone up. And that's because new states are implementing procedures, making it easier for voters to vote that way. And the states that already have that, you often see the campaigns driving people there. So I guess I do expect close to 40%. That would be up from the mid-30s last time. I am a little, like Michael, reluctant to make a lot of predictions based on these numbers that come in on the first day of early voting. Lots of Democrats were voting. That does reflect, I think, the fact that the Clinton campaign is a more organized campaign. That's, I think, obvious to everybody, that they're taking their resources and driving their voters to the polls. That's a good thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that the mix of the election or even the voter turnout will be better, because, again, you can efficiently, and it's smart to do, drive your voters to vote earlier and get them locked in. But of course, then there are voters on Election Day, and that mix may come back to help Republicans more on Election Day. So I think the number will be higher, but I think we should be very cautious about what we say even early on as to whether some people are voting at the very beginning of the early voting period or whether they vote later, and whether Democrats are doing better than Republicans.
Thanks very much, John. We're now going to turn to Henry to talk about the future of the GOP. And I guess my question is, will Trumpism survive Trump?
Well, I think the Trumpism is different depending on the eyes of the beholder. I think some of the uglier elements of Trumpism won't survive Trump, because there's going to be very little element or incentive for Republicans to repeat that. So you can pretty much see that a number of things that he said might excite a tiny minority but turns off a mass majority. But other elements of Trumpism are part of the body politic, and they were present for anyone who could have been inclined to see them. What Donald Trump effectively was the person who picks up the $100 bill on the sidewalk. Economists tell you that markets are efficient, so that one should never be found there. The market would already have picked it up. But in fact, we know that markets are inefficient, that there are market leaders, and Donald Trump managed to see what nobody else in the entire Republican establishment saw, which was that there was a vast number of people who wanted a solution to their issues that was not being addressed, and that the solutions they wanted were fit nicely between left and right in the current political spectrum. And he offered that, and they responded. The future of the GOP is complicated because it is connected in some way with the future of whether Trumpism survives Trump. It's tempting to say that we've been here before, that the Republicans were written out of the future in 1964 after Barry Goldwater's 24-point loss, and after 1976 when Republicans had fewer than a third of the seats in the House and Gerald Ford had lost the presidency. There were claims that the party was on its way out, and the Minnesota party actually renamed itself the Independent Republican Party because who wants to be one of those icky national Republicans? And briefly, we had that flurry of what's going on with the GOP after Barack Obama's election and the supermajority that Democrats temporarily held in the Senate. There's a lot of reason to discount that because, first of all, the Republicans have bounced back after all of those cases, and Republicans are stronger now than they were in any of those elections. But the fact remains that you can't change the country without the presidency, that Republicans have lost, if they lose this time, the popular vote in 6 of the last 7 elections, that they've only broken 48% of the popular vote once, and that was the year they won the popular vote in 2004, and that unless something changes with respect to Republican appeals to demographic groups, every 4 years, the groups likeliest to vote Republican die off and are replaced by groups that are less likely to vote Republican. It's a slow change, but it's a real change, kind of like the tide eroding the beach. You can wake up one morning and not notice that the beach is any smaller, but if you come back in a couple of years, you'll notice that the beach is smaller. So the Republicans have to deal with all of that. The Republicans will do so also against dramatic disagreement within their ranks, that the disagreement is both tactical as to how to respond, which voter groups to try to appeal to, but also philosophical, that there's wide differences of opinion over what issues are important and what should be tackled and how they should be tackled. And the tactics often are dictated by the people's philosophies. So the real division is that the Republican coalition no longer agrees with each other on very much. What's called the establishment, I would say the John Boehner Chamber of Commerce wing, primarily wants to focus on managing an existing government, wealth creation, and are cautiously in favor of cosmopolitanism. These are the sort of Republicans who would say that the future is likely to be bright and not be afraid of social changes that are happening in the world. The religious conservative is backward looking. They see a change as their enemy, not as their friend, and they want to focus on conserving as much of their heritage and their influence as possible. The fiscal conservative wants to continue on shrinking government and taxation, even when it moves against a consensus in favor of a certain program. And Trump voters who are now part of the Republican Party and borrow from voters who used to think of themselves in other factions want nationalism. They want a broader sense of American identity. They want a broader sense of an active government that will help them and protect them against perceived threats, whether they're economic in the case of immigration or trade, or whether it's security in the case of Muslim terrorism. So there's wide disagreement within the Republican Party, and that's going to make solving the electoral problem difficult. In part, that's because fundamentally for most of the last 50 years, the Republicans, when they are not a minority party, has been a negative union, that they unite in what they're against. And it's one reason why they tend to have their biggest gains and their strongest in opposition. They have in effect been a confederation like America was after the Revolutionary War. In order to win, and in order to have wins matter, they need to move from agreeing what they're against to agreeing on what they're for. They need to become a more perfect union. They need to have their constitutional moment where they become a federation. And if you can do this, which is something that Ronald Reagan was able to do, take disparate factions that agreed on what they were against but agreed little on what they were for, and weave them together into something that one can affirmatively be for, then I think the Republicans can be the majority party in this country. I think it's pretty clear that voters are not in love with the progressive Democratic agenda. When they see it clearly before them, they vote against it. When they have a responsible, moderately conservative Republicanism, as they do in the states, they support it over and over again, even in purple states that will go for Democrats this time. But it'll take strategy and forbearance to overcome these differences. After 1964, when the party was much more divided and much more diverse intellectually than it is today, the warring factions all decided to cool it down. Ronald Reagan went around the country telling people that party unity was more important, that labels like conservative, moderate, and liberal Republican were foisted upon Republicans by their enemies, and that they had more in common than they had against the Democrats. Bill Buckley moved from being somebody who wouldn't endorse Richard Nixon in '60 because he wasn't good enough to being one who said that conservatives support the most conservative electable candidate. In other words, conservatism ceased to be confrontational and started to be incremental. And the left chose not to try and purge the Goldwaters from their party and wage a last-ditch battle to say that the party ought not to admit people who supported the nominee who went down to defeat. The RNC tried to unite the factions, and they've found victory 4 years later. I think this is the sort of effort that a Republican Party needs to do. It requires maturity on behalf of all of the different factions, but a Republican Party that hangs together is one that can be victorious, and one that divides itself will all hang separately.
Thank you, Henry. I think we all know that it's hard for third parties to gain a foothold in our politics, but I was stunned by a poll finding that's just come out a few minutes ago from the new Public Religion Research Institute poll that was released this morning. 6 in 10, up from 48% in 1990, said that neither party represents their views, including 54% of Republicans and 46% of Democrats. Third-party prospects within the GOP?
I don't think third-party prospects are very high because we have such an easy way to influence one of the original two parties because of our primary system. It's much more thinking of it as a business proposition. You can either launch a hostile takeover and take over somebody else's brand, which is what a primary challenge is, or you can go through all of the problems of setting up your own small business and institute your own capital costs and create a new brand. It's much easier rather than put up a green party to influence the Democrats in a green direction by running green-like candidates on its Democrats, and the same is true on the Republicans. I think what it shows is the massive opportunity that both parties have to create an enduring majority, that the sort of people who are happy with their parties are likelier to be the sort of people who are ideologically committed and likely to be the sort of people who are alienating people who are between left and right. I think there's a massive opportunity for people who engage with what can be called the radical American middle to form to reduce that number and form a more enduring coalition than what we've had over the last 20 years.
Thank you. Norm, your thoughts about what you've heard thus far this morning and how Hillary Clinton would govern if she's to be elected?
Thanks, Karlyn. Just on the third party point, what we're seeing now in the final few weeks is what we usually see with third party candidates, which is support is declining. Kind of peaks about a month before an election. And there are some exceptions to that, and obviously we have flawed third party candidates. When Gary Johnson basically suggested that he thought Aleppo was the missing Marx brother, that didn't bode well for his ability to act as president, and Jill Stein in a similar fashion. Another point which I will come back to as we talk about governing. When we look at the poll averages now, most of those poll averages include all the polls, and that includes a lot of squishy polls. If you separate out those that the analysts call the gold standard ones, which is polls that use real people asking questions, not robocalls, that have cell phones included as well as landlines, and take those out, Clinton's lead goes up to between 9 and 10 points. Now, that may not last, and we don't know whether even poll averages work much anymore with the challenges to the polling world. But there's a real difference in the capacity to govern and in the margins that we'll see in the House and Senate if you win a presidential election by 4 points or 6 points or 10 points. There's no direct rule of thumb, but I would say if Clinton wins a popular margin of 10 points, the House goes. And what happens when you have an election that we call a wave election is that almost all the close ones begin to tip. And what we've seen in the past in the House is you get some races that nobody saw as even being close that are stunning surprises. I remember one year, and Michael will remember this, when Lionel Van Deerlen of California around San Diego, who'd won was 75% in the preceding election, got 49%, and nobody saw that coming. Now, that may not happen, but that's just something to keep in mind. Another point, we haven't talked about the referendums. John and I were talking earlier. There are 5 states that have referendums on legalizing marijuana. And I predict that there will be a massive turnout in those states on Wednesday, November 9th.
Hungry voters.
Yes, yes. Dude, today? Oh. I was in Las Vegas last week for the debate, and it was not a good one for Donald Trump. You could see it coming. It's at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. This is not a guy who's done well either with gambling or universities. But all of this means, I think, that the Democrats at this point, especially because Trump seems to be insistent on doubling down on his approach, which is to excite his own base and not do much of anything to move beyond that. The only exception to that is an ad that's running in a number of places that does focus on change. And, this was an election going in where the headwinds are always working against the party that's been in the White House for 8 years. And Hillary Clinton would struggle to be a candidate of change. But Donald Trump has not been able to exploit that very well. And now he's even expanded, getting back to the rigged election business. He's talking much more about a vast conspiracy that involves the FBI, all the agencies of government, the polls that are being manipulated, all of them except the handful, including the internet ones, that work to his advantage to go against him, all of the news media. And I think we really are going to see a segue out of this into a Trump media network. There will be probably a Trump radio show, and maybe he'll be on 2 hours a day. There'll be a Trump television network that'll move to the right of Fox, and there'll be Breitbart. And the focus is going to be continuing on the conspiracy, including by Republican elites who stabbed him in the back. And all of that is going to contribute to the difficulty in the climate of governing. Now, let's say that we end up where, at least at this point, conventional wisdom would suggest, which is Democrats winning a narrow victory in the Senate. And it could be 6, 7, or 8 seats, but it's more likely to be 4 or 5, and pick up 15 to 20 seats in the House of Representatives. The key here, and certainly one key, is whether they win the Senate. If Hillary Clinton wins the White House and Republicans continue to control the Senate, we're going to see an awful environment for governing. First of all, she will find many of her own executive appointments will be blocked or delayed, and judges, obviously. With a Democratic Senate, which is significantly more important to her than the House, you not only have Republicans, some who she knows well from her time in the Senate, who might well be willing to work with her on a series of issues, but also you'll be able, after a few months, to turn the Senate into a confirmation factory, including at least below the Supreme Court level with judges. If what we see is a continued resistance with filibuster to confirm any Supreme Court nominee, whether it's Merrick Garland or somebody else who's picked, and I can imagine Clinton meeting with Republicans in the Senate after the election and saying, if you commit to a quick confirmation, I will renominate Merrick Garland. If you won't do that, I'll pick somebody much younger and much more liberal. going for 6 or 9 months through a filibuster before changing the rules again to move that to a simple majority. One of the things that I find most interesting now, and I have a piece out at theatlantic.com today on this, is the House and the dynamic and the future of Paul Ryan. We know that the Republicans who are leaving the House voluntarily are disproportionately those who are leadership loyalists. You know, we don't think of moderates much anymore. They're conservatives, but they're leadership loyalists. And the ones who are most at risk fall generally in that category. And that means if they lose 15 or 20 seats, the Freedom Caucus is going to be proportionally stronger. And along with Freedom Caucus members, many of whom are very unhappy with Paul Ryan, a number of whom, led by the agitator Mark Meadows, who led the effort to oust John Boehner, say that they will vote against him. We have outside forces like Sean Hannity saying that he's a saboteur, and Breitbart saying that he's actually working for Hillary Clinton. And we've got 20 or 30 other Republicans who are not Freedom Caucus members who are strong Trump supporters who also believe that he hasn't been strong enough there. If you have a Republican margin of 10 seats in the House, it is very, very possible that you get a vote for Speaker on the floor where he does not prevail. And it's also possible that he'll take a look at this and decide that he'd rather be Ways and Means Chairman or spend more time with his family, the traditional out. And if he's looking at his long-term future, being out of the House might be a better option for him. But if he prevails and moves forward and you end up without a majority on the first ballot, all kinds of weird things can happen. We've had a number of states in the past where the parties were closely divided and they end up working out a deal where somebody comes from out of left field or right field to be a speaker. And Democrats are already talking about what the strategy might be under those circumstances. Could you move towards perhaps the only moderate Republican in the House, Charlie Dent? Not so likely, in part because I'm not sure you could get enough Republican support to go along with the Democrats to make that happen. Or could you go for somebody who wasn't even in the House at all, because you don't have to be a member of the House? Tom Davis or a Vin Weber, along with some changes in the rules to make it closer to the regular order. These are fanciful and very unlikely to happen, but we're in a very different territory because of the challenges within the Republican Party right now and the pressure that's going to be there from outside. Now, you could say, well, they'll teach Ryan a lesson, which is what the Freedom Caucus was talking about a few months ago. Vote against him on the first ballot and make it clear that he better respond to their demands. But when you have outside forces putting enormous pressure on, and if you vote against him on the first ballot and vote for him on the second, you may get a primary challenge or at least an enormous amount of heat coming from tribal media. That can mean a very different dynamic. Finally, let me say, with all of this, the challenges for governance are going to be extraordinarily high. And the question is, will there be even a brief window of a couple of months where you could do an infrastructure package, a budget deal, maybe one that could avoid another showdown on the debt ceiling, some kind of a fix in the healthcare area, and maybe even begin to move towards a different dialogue on immigration and on jobs and poverty. That's the critical question right now. I think it can happen in the Senate. It's much more difficult to make that happen in the House of Representatives. And then we turn to another dynamic that gets to something that Henry was saying. How do you recapture your mojo if you lose the presidency for the third time in a row, lose the Senate, which you will gain back in 2 years? There are 25 Democrats up in the Senate in 2018 to only 8 Republicans. And at least 10 or 11 of those Democrats in a difficult environment would have some trouble, only a couple of the Republicans at most. You win back your mojo by winning in 2018. And how do you do that? We have a formula from 2010 and 2014. You delegitimize the president, you delegitimize the entire governing process, you excite and incite that anger from the populist right. And that can work. But as a short-term fix, it is a long-term catastrophe. And that, I'm afraid, may be the direction that we head.
Thanks very much, Norm. Norm, do you see a fight with the progressive wing of her party coming?
Yeah, I do. And that's where the margin of victory in the presidential contest becomes very, very important for Clinton. If this is a close election in the end, especially after it looks like it could be a blowout, the leverage on the left is going to be extraordinarily high. It'll be there with Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and others in the confirmation process. And that constrains the kinds of people, in some cases, that Clinton will be able to pick. So I think she will want to have a woman as Treasury Secretary, which we've never had before, a woman as Secretary of Defense, which we have not had before. We've had women at State and at Justice, the other two in the Big Four, at Homeland Security. Lael Brainerd, who would be an obvious choice, might face some pushback. I think that Raskin, Sarah Bloom Raskin, who's the Deputy Treasury Secretary now, would be an easier choice. I don't think there'll be nearly as much difficulty for Michelle Flournoy at Defense, but almost any of the positions in Treasury or in the financial world are going to have a different picture, and you're going to see a constant pressure from the left to move policy in that direction. That's a challenge for Democrats in part because as you see Clinton doing so much better among highly educated white voters, there's an opportunity there to move some of them over and away from Republican ranks. But if you respond to that pressure on the left, you're going to lose those voters and not be able to build that larger and more enduring majority. The bigger her margin, the more flexibility she has outside of the confirmation process.
Thanks, Norm. I have one final question for the panel, but I want you to be thinking about your questions. And I also want to remind you that we will be back on November 10th. It's a luncheon, not a breakfast, to talk about what happened and why. But my question to all of you on the panel is, what would you urge Hillary Clinton to do first if she wins big and if she wins narrowly?
Well, I would say my first priority would be a big infrastructure package. We often say as social scientists, there are no panaceas out there. That's as close as you come to a panacea. We know that we have bipartisan support for a program that would take profits from companies abroad, repatriate them with a significant proportion invested in long-term, low-interest infrastructure bonds. You know you can create high-value jobs for that group of people who are most discontented, the working class population. We know we have enormous needs, not just with bridges and dams and the locks system and sewers, but also the electrical grid and protecting against cyber attacks and broadband and other areas. And you could really get the economy a boost by doing that. That would be my number one priority. And number two would be trying to institutionalize the McConnell rule back, which means that you're not going to have debt ceiling disasters.
I'm also curious about what you think about other than a legislative agenda. What will she do in the first few weeks as she begins to move into her appointments and others? Thoughts?
Well, look, I think there are many ways in which I think we basically agree that unless it's a very, very large win, we're going to have some form of divided government. And so there are many ways in which the dynamic is going to look like it has looked like the last 6 years. And for Hillary Clinton, I think immediately to turn to some legislative things or to push for them, whether they're successful or not is likely. But there still is for her to find ways in which the executive can act by themselves, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's executive action. I guess I also watch on the court. The court is, we'll talk about that for the first long time, I expect, but I assume that eventually Hillary Clinton, if she's president, will get a nominee, will get somebody on the court. The court might be much more favorable to certain executive actions in some places than, and there will be a push from a progressive side for the court to do things in that way. So I think there are lots of ways in which a divided government, we can be hopeful that there'll be some small accomplishments, some working together, but a lot of it will be, the pressure will be to move towards executive-only actions that we've seen in the last 6 years.
Michael or Henry?
I think she's put herself in, or events have put her in a position that will be difficult to pivot from. You know, Richard Nixon supposedly said that you campaign in the primaries on the extreme of your party, the right and the Republican, the left and the Democratic, and moved to the center in the general election. We haven't seen a lot of that from her. On domestic policy, she's way off to the left on a whole series of things. The prospect that John alludes to of more executive actions is a prospect for continued feeling on the part of a large part of the public that she's acting and many Republicans that she's acting illegitimately, as they felt President Obama has been doing. I don't see a lot of easy polarization, depolarizing kind of things you can do. Norm suggests infrastructure. I need to learn more about this perhaps, but I don't see, it doesn't create a lot of jobs for people who have been out of the workforce, who have been, this large number of men who have been out of the workforce, who are on disability, who are taking drugs and so forth. It's a problem we've become increasingly aware of and don't know how to solve or how to have government help solve. These are not the people that are going to get the jobs on the infrastructure, and we've been through that in the stimulus package of 2009. It just didn't, you don't have guys digging shovels on the roads like you did in the 1930s. So I think she's in a difficult position. I think she's got to have some serious foreign policy challenges. We've seen, the spread of Iranian power throughout the Middle East and Russian power, and this current shocking statement by the Philippines president, who sounds sort of wacky, but
Psychopath is
allying
the
with
word.
China. Well, psychopath, but it's a country of 80 million people, and it's in a very important part of the world, and it's a genuine problem. If she's seeking bipartisanship, I think there are probably some foreign policy avenues where she could and where it's not entirely inconsistent with her record. I think on domestic policy, I think that we're just going to see more hyper-partisanship and not effective government action.
Henry.
I think that she needs to recognize the political situation that she'll be in and her party is in. I talked about the Republicans might have, if they lose, will have lost 6 of 7. But the Democrats will have only, in winning 6 of 7, will have only reached a majority of the vote twice. That if she wins, she's highly likely not to have a majority of the vote. She's highly likely to win another plurality victory, and she's likely to win while being upside down in her favorability ratings, which is, say, she will have won a negative victory, not a positive victory. Bill Clinton mistook a negative victory in 1992 for a positive victory and tried to govern from the left and was handed the 1994 election. And I remember reading an interview he had with David Broder after that, and Broder basically quoted him as saying, "Oh, that's right, I got 43% of the vote. I should think of this like a coalition government." She would be wise to remember that, which is to say that if she wins, she will likely not to have majority favorability. She's likely to not have a majority of the vote. The Democratic Party has been getting rejected at the state level. When it tries to govern in context with the progressive left, the Republicans come back from the dead and win negative elections like 2010. And I think she should try and figure out what do you do to move forward, to try and break that deadlock so that she gains favorability from the center that doesn't feel in touch with the Democratic Party, and tries to break the deadlock that has kept the Democrats out of majority status for the last 20 years.
Thanks, Henry. And now we'll turn to your questions. And we'll start at the back of the room, back there. And if you could please identify yourselves.
My name is Joe Freeman. I'm a political scientist. I do follow the polls, but not as closely as you all do. I have been rather struck by the fact that the polls, which include third-party candidates, show Gary Johnson doing about 3 or 4 times better than Jill Stein, and I'd like your interpretation of that. My interpretation is that the Democratic primary voters who voted for Bernie are more willing to vote for the Democratic nominee than the Republican primary voters who voted for other candidates are willing to vote for Trump. But as I said, I don't watch the polls as closely as you do. How would you interpret the fact that Johnson is doing so much better than Stein?
I think your interpretation is as good as any. And I mean, the interesting thing about third-party votes here, and it alludes to what Henry said, the young voters. I mean, you see some of these surveys where among under 30s, you're getting 20% plus for either Johnson or Stein. And I think that, and Hillary Clinton is far below the 66 and 60% that Barack Obama got from that age group in 2008 and 2012. Getting those people to vote is going to be, and vote for her is, I think, one of her major tasks. And if I were trying to advance Trump's cause, I would be spending money on deconstructing Hillary Clinton with young voters through whatever newfangled social media they use.
Any other thoughts about that,
Well,
John?
no, I will say that the numbers for the third-party candidates in polls have come down pretty significantly, and I guess I expect them to keep coming down. It is true on young voters. We had, I think it's even higher than that. We had some surveys where really you had nearly 40% of young voters be uncertain of the two candidates, want a third party or were undecided. That is, and Utah's a particular state, but just nationally, I think they're, and Clinton has benefited, I think, from this coming down, because there really were, especially a lot of young voters who were pulling the lever for, or telling pollsters that they would support Gary Johnson. The other thing I would just note is that I assume Gary Johnson will do better than this, but the Libertarian Party has its record for national poll numbers is just breaking 1%. So the idea that Gary Johnson is going to get 7-8%, as some people are thinking, is I think is pretty fanciful. I think that number is coming down pretty significantly.
And keep in mind that Evan McMullen is the only one who is likely to win any electoral votes, a guy with $4,000 in the bank.
There's one poll that I like to look at, just is the battleground poll, cross-indexes favorability with vote preference. And what we find is that virtually nobody likes both of these candidates. You either just like Trump or you just like Clinton, but there's a lot of people who don't like either of them, and that's where the third-party vote is concentrated. That among the 18% of Americans who told the battleground pollsters that they don't like Clinton and Trump, about 60% of them have not yet picked a candidate, and the bulk of that's in the third party. So I think what it shows is that Democrats like Hillary Clinton, independents don't, and they tend to find two former governors who are not, who are running basically as conventional Republicans more interesting than Jill Stein.
Okay, back here and then there.
Much appreciated. I'm Randy Foreman. I write for Political Storm. I wanted to get your take on the John Podesta, excuse me, the John Podesta WikiLeaks released emails where his team recommended oversamples so that the Clinton team could maximize their media polling. They produced a 37-page guide for pollsters. What does it mean for this race, the data that you, the media, and we all go off of, and what does it mean for the future of polling if the Clinton's team were found to be fixing these polls with oversamples?
Oversampling is not necessarily fixing a poll. It's a standard polling technique when you're trying to look at a smaller subgroup and get meaningful results with reduced margin of error among a group that's going to come out to be 3% of your national total, like Asians, for example. If you want to know more about Asians, you better, in a 1,000-person interview, 3% is 30 people. That's doesn't tell you anything. I mean, the classic example, apparently, Nate Cohn of the New York Times uncovered the LA Times University of Southern California poll where they were doing different weighting projects, and they ended up in their weighting a 19-year-old black male from Illinois times 30, and he was a Trump supporter, and he was moving 1% of their things, and then he stopped participating, and it's a panel back that goes by. I'm getting into the weeds on this, but the answer, I think I can speak for the whole panel, is I think the Clinton campaign has done a lot of nefarious and nauseating things, but fixing media polls is not one of them.
Boy, I would love to be in the room when Kellyanne Conway, who does a lot of oversampling when she does her polls, was either trying to educate Donald Trump about what oversampling is or decided it wasn't worth it. That after 30 seconds of that, he'd be off doing something else.
Well, she's trying to steal his phone,
Yeah,
so
that's
he
right.
won't.
Yeah.
So he won't tweet at 3 a.m.
It would be irresponsible not to oversample small groups if you really want to talk about those groups with some reliability. Absolutely. All pollsters do it. It's widely accepted. It's a standard technique. Okay, we've got a lot of questions back here. We'll go to Wayne Vallis.
Hi, Wayne Vallis. I used to work here many years ago. Hillary Clinton has twice had periods where she had executive authority. In 1993, Hillary Clinton had an office in the East Wing, traditional First Lady work, as they say. She put together a secretive healthcare office that she ran in what was then called the old Executive Office Building. She put together the presidential personnel shop, all the appointments, and she came up with an ethnicity, gender, the eggs test. So she ran the office, she ran presidential personnel, and she demanded an office in the West Wing as the consigliere with one you get two, where she was the co-president for a while, for 18 months until that all collapsed. When she was the co-governor, and she was Hillary Rodham in Arkansas, that led to the defeat of her husband against that fellow White in the first term. Do you think there's much prospect, given her twice she had power, where she had co-power as the executive, and it wasn't a very good experience?
We'll see. I mean, you're making some arguments that people could make against Hillary Clinton. Others might say she's going to learn from experience. She stubbed her toe, and she's not going to walk into that doorway too narrowly again.
There's some questions in the back, or actually up here. Let's put all these four on the table, then anyone can answer them because we don't have a lot of time. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. And please make your questions quick. Yes, go ahead.
Barbara Bowie Whitman. I've only been an activist in the Republican Party for a little over half a century. Going to Henry's topic, I think it can be argued that we got the candidate we have this year based on the process. The process being open primaries in many states. Most of the primaries that Trump swept were open ones where non-Republicans could vote. And the other process question had to do with rules in the convention. But the primary one is one that I'd like to examine a little more, because an open primary allows people who aren't registered Republican to vote, and for anybody who's been an activist inside a party, they want choices made by the party, but it does bring in new people. What do you think on that general issue?
And to John, what's your question?
John Gizzi, Chief Political Correspondent for Newsmax. Very simply, there's been a lot of reporting lately about the different attitudes of people on the lower part of the ticket toward the top. Congressman Heck of Nevada, the Senate candidate, disendorsed Trump. On the other hand, 2 of the 3 Republicans running for the House in Nevada, Mr. Tarkanian and Congressman Amodio, are sticking with the nominee. Yeah. Senator Toomey has said he wishes he could vote for him but couldn't because of his stands on entitlements and Russia. What is the effect of either disendorsing, embracing, or remaining neutral on the top of the ticket?
Okay, and this question here?
Great.
I think, right, yeah.
Robert Brooks. I'm a business person from Duluth, Minnesota. I'm intrigued with the question of the margin of Hillary Clinton's victory and what it may and how it may relate to party unity for both parties. I'm struck with some of what I've heard that, and this is of course all in the realm of speculation, I understand, but if current polls remain and she does win, her margin of victory, it would seem like if it's narrow, it would be a problem for GOP unity. If it's large, it may be helpful, using some of the examples that Henry gave. And alternatively, for the Democrats, if it's narrow, it may enhance party unity. If it's greater, it may be a problem for party unity. I'd be interested in any comment on that.
And the fourth question. And yours will be the final question.
Thank you, Larry Checco. Like it or not, 30 or 40 million Americans are going to be voting for Donald Trump, it appears at least. And much like
50 or 60.
50 or 60 million?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. That's even worse. The point is that, the Tea Party coalesced a long time ago, and we saw what happened. But at least they wanted to get into governing. They wanted to get into the Capitol. A lot of these people want to burn the Capitol down. Are we in a downward spiral of governance? And that is very scary.
Okay. 4 questions: open primaries, party unity with a narrow or a big win, those people who are distancing themselves from Trump, and finally, are we in a downward spiral?
Can I take the primaries question, Barbara's question? I think there is a lot of back and forth within party circles as to what to do about this. I think one thing our primary system showed, and I know a lot of people think if it had been arranged differently, maybe Trump wouldn't have been the nominee. It showed that there are not a lot of good options for party insiders to really take down somebody who can win in these primaries. I mean, certainly at the convention, all the thoughts of Stop Trump were they were difficult, and I think if they'd been brought further to the American people, there was a lot of argument saying, the people have spoken, and we want to take that away from them. So I think a lot of Donald Trump's arguments about the big things at the convention, about the little things of delegates being selected who really weren't loyal to Trump but were loyal to Cruz on the second ballot, I think he was winning that argument. Your more specific question about the actual open primary versus a closed primary. A lot of people are going to vote in the general election that are not voters in the Republican primary. I mean, I think it's ultimately in the party's interest to have somewhat more of an open primary system. I think it would be a mistake to clamp down and to sort of have just the voices of those who don't represent a wider slice of the people. If you look at, and this is an extreme example, but when Republicans were in the extreme minority in the South, needed to get a foothold, they opened up primaries so that people could acclimate themselves to voting the Republican Party. So I think it would be wise for Republicans to be not reacting too strongly and saying, let's close down our primaries. Let's allow that to be a place where they can bring a candidate that can win general elections.
There's also a technical issue, which is that a lot of states, particularly a lot of large states, don't have party registration. So there's nothing that you can do to close the primary. Well, yeah, I mean, Virginia, Ohio, Michigan.
You could have a convention.
So if you,
that works.
Well, that's what I was going to get to, which is that if you really only want to do activists, what you have to do is remove voter choice entirely. You need to, even caucuses will attract non-Republicans because in states that don't have party registration, you can't keep them out. There's no way to know a priori who people are. So. The only way to do that in almost half the states is to remove the primary process entirely, and that would run against the current grain of thinking. So I think the other thing is Donald Trump won states with closed primaries. He dominated in Louisiana, which was a closed primary. He dominated in Florida against Marco Rubio, which was a closed primary. The Nevada caucus was a closed caucus, and he dominated that. It's just a fiction and a myth that Donald Trump relied on crossover voting from people who don't think of themselves as Republicans. Yeah. Donald Trump did not win the party activist Republican, the most ideological Republican, but he won almost everybody else, even though they think of themselves as Republicans.
I'm going to take a slightly contrary position that also gets into some of these other questions. It wasn't the system that got Donald Trump. And remember that when we got to the end, there were 2 candidates who conceivably could have won a nomination. The outsider Trump, the insider Cruz. And that reflects that deeper division in the party that I believe is a self-inflicted wound by establishment leaders. And it gets to your question, Larry, which is if you say that all of government is illegitimate and all of these actions are terrible and Washington is the worst place possible, you're going to convince a lot of your own voters that they ought to throw out all of those figures from Washington. And if you're going to go with a Washington guy, well, maybe you lean towards the guy who gets on the floor of the Senate and calls his own leader a liar, which is Ted Cruz. So you've got a big problem there, and you have a problem there that is going to be extended down the road if you have a nominee who says they're all part of a vast conspiracy, and you get a lot of people who believe that. And if you say that the president is illegitimate, then how do your own party members work with somebody who's illegitimate? That also is a part of the problem that John suggested. You know, if you are running now as a House or Senate member, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You abandon your party's nominee, and those people who believe in him ardently are going to see you as part of the problem, and they may vote against you. And if you embrace that nominee, then you're stuck with all of the things that that candidate stands for. And so you've got all of these people doing these ridiculous tightrope walks where you get people endorsing and then unendorsing and then re-endorsing, or saying, well, I don't endorse, I just support, or I can't stand this guy, but I've got to vote for him because of the Supreme Court. And, you know, some of them are going to suffer as a consequence. And you get the cases of a Kelly Ayotte who, you know, has the great misfortune of saying in a debate that he's a role model for our children the 2 days before the Access Hollywood tape comes out. And it's a little hard to get away from that. But that's the larger problem that faces the party. And on the question of the rules, the Democrats have an even bigger problem, I think, with what's going to be tremendous pressure from Sanders and others to get rid of superdelegates and open up all of the primaries. And if you had done that, you might well have had a different result on the Democratic side.
Michael.
Well, a lot to chew on here. I think you know, we're looking at the very high likelihood of a Hillary Clinton victory that will not be a victory for Hillary Clinton's policies, but a victory against a celebrity candidate nominated by the other party and something in the nature of a hostile takeover. I mean, John Gizzi referenced the problems, the dissonance between Republican candidates, and I note the Senate polling in a lot of states is very different from the president polling. We've been a straight ticket country in 2012, 08, 04, 00, when the party's presidential nominees pretty much lined up on policies with parties' congressional nominees, to a much greater extent than the 70s and 80s, when there was a lot of difference, particularly among Democrats, but also Republicans. Now we're back to that situation where you had in 1896, when Grover Cleveland, the incumbent Democratic president, said he was voting for the Republican candidate William McKinley and not the Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan, who had taken it over. The Democrats were stuck with Bryan for the next 12 years, and they lost. Bryan was 36 years old when he was first nominated. Perhaps the good news for the Republican Party is that Donald Trump is 70. He does have.
But Junior is.
Well, he's got three articulate adult children who are of an age eligible to run for president. So.
And on that note.
Well, let me just say, it's not a policy victory for Hillary Clinton, and it's curious. Al Gore and Richard Nixon nearly were elected president for winning a third term for his party at a time when incumbent presidents on policy, President Clinton, President Eisenhower, were popular. Hillary Clinton may end up doing what they did, even though Obamacare is not and has never been majority popular, and right now is imploding. Despite the fact that the keystone of Barack Obama's foreign policy presidency, as presented by Ben Rhodes, the Henry Kissinger of the millennial generation, is the Iran nuclear deal. That is unpopular with the majority of Congress, with the majority of American people. So it places her, and indeed in the Republicans, in a difficult situation. Whether the Republicans have majority in the Senate or not, whether they have majority in the House or not, places the country in a difficult situation. We've had a president who lacks the skill and capacity to negotiate with Congress and the inclination to do so. So we'll see if things improve.
Please join me in thanking the panel, and we will see you on November 10th. Thank you.